Welcome everybody to the session. I'm going to start off with an acknowledgement of country, as we traditionally do, but I'm going to do it more as a kind of a prayer prayer blessing that I've written for Prayer for Australia, which will also be an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, whose land I am located in, and I'm aware that people across Australia will be in different parts of the country. But we say, we bless our country of Australia and all its people. Let us have dreams in this land of long dreams. Let the hot winds of the desert fire our imagination, and the red soils of the plains keep us rooted to the things that really matter. Let our rivers, our lakes, and our oceans flow into our hearts, giving us depth and understanding. Let us remember the original inhabitants of these lingering songlines. We remember their pain, their loss, and their anguish, and we identify and we recognize their suffering and pray that their restatement of their rights and connection to this land. May we stand as strong and as mighty as our mountains and be as gentle as our places of quiet beauty. Let our compassion be like the encompassing coastlines of our singular continent, and may peace move steadily across the waters of this ancient and enduring land. So welcome to everybody here on behalf of the Jewish Independent. For those of you who are not that familiar with the Jewish Independent, previously called +61J, it prides itself on original reporting and insightful analysis on the issues that most concern Jews, both Jews of Australia, the things that we care about, Israel, Australia, Jewish communities across the world, and how we as Jews can help make this rather wounded and battered world that we are living in, this battered planet, how we can make it into a better kind of place, how we can help tame some of the savage impulses of humanity. Well, for tonight's session, we are really fortunate to have with us three, to use the Australian expression, three cracker speakers who are going to bring insightful, I'm sure, and original thought to a subject that is close to many of us, but especially close to those of us who have a connection, like myself, not only to Israel, but also to what Alan Paton called the beloved country of South Africa. Just in terms of the way we're going to run this evening, before I'm going to introduce each of the participants with a particular question, and then have a more general kind of discussion. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to have a Q&A. So please, you can put on the chat and on the comments, and we'll try and respond to as many of the questions as possible. So let's start. So I'd like to start with yourself, Wayne. And I just want to mention that Wayne Sussman is the director of American Jewish Committee's Africa Institute. Wayne is very well known to South African audiences, and he appears regularly on CSA TV networks and provides a lot of in-depth and multimedia analysis on political developments and, of course, recently on the elections in South Africa. So, Wayne, I'm starting with you because hoping that you can provide us with a little bit of background and an update on the latest new coalition government, very fresh, and it'll be helpful maybe if you can explain a little bit about the coalition parties that are, or partners that are together with the ANC now. And I'm going to give you each just a few minutes, please try for about 5 minutes just to respond to my first question. And also, if you get a chance in those 5 minutes to condense in that, what it actually means to the ANC as well.
Thank you, Rabbi Genende. Let me first start off by stating that many years ago, I came to speak at Limud, Australia, and I love public speaking. But if I had to look at my public speaking career, I'm going to put my hands up now and say that that was not my finest hour. So it's a real honor to get a second chance at wowing an Australian audience. So I really appreciate this invitation. I've been to Melbourne and Sydney on numerous occasions. I've got family there, other interests. So it's great to be on this in this discussion and webinar today, and certainly with Ivor, Chipkin and Karen Milner as well, two remarkable South African individuals. So when one looks at the ANC's trajectory over the last few elections, since 2009, if one had to draw a graph, and I had to put up a graph, which I'm not going to do, you'd see that they declined by 4 percentage points in each election. So they went from 70 to 66, 66 to 62, 62 to 58. So the fact that we arrive at a situation where they are now under 40% of the vote, that they declined by 18 percentage points in this last election, is absolutely staggering. Opinion polls suggested before the elections that the ANC was in perilous trouble. I did also an in-depth analysis of all by-elections, and it pointed to the same thing. But we'd always known that in national elections, the ANC has the ability to put itself up by the bootstraps, whatever the Australian version of that expression is, because Australians are very expressive people, and get itself over the line. And to be honest, I had a small moment in history, because we were the first network to announce that the ANC was going to fall below 50%, the network called ENCA, and my legs were shaking as I made this projection with our model. But our model actually, to be honest, got it wrong, because the ANC did far worse than what we projected. So why did the ANC land up in this position? There was a juggernaut in KwaZulu-Natal. So for KwaZulu-Natal is probably like the Queensland of South Africa, like the Brisbane of Brisbane, I suppose, is like Durban. I hope that analogy works. It's the second most populous province, so maybe that's more New South Wales, doesn't matter. 21% of the voters in South Africa are there, and this is where the former. So this was important. And what we saw here on election day was a stunning result. The ANC essentially losing 66% of its support in the second most populous part of the province. Now, there are those viewers who might also know about the Kruger National Park. That's a province called Mpumalanga, coal country. What is stunning is that we've had other Zulu ethnic parties in the past do well, but that's been confined to KwaZulu-Natal. Now, Zulu is spoken in some other provinces. And you saw some of the parts of this province called Mpumalanga. There's this big district where MK was the most popular party. So this juggernaut spread through KwaZulu-Natal to parts of Mpumalanga. Karen, Ivor, and I are currently in Gauteng, which is the economic powerhouse. When you land into OR Tambo Airport, there is, you're actually in a different city. Traditionally, for those who might remember the East Rand, many Zulu-speaking townships, the same thing happening there. So this party ends up getting 14, 15% of the vote, and that is where the ANC loses a lot of support. Now, another interesting development is that there's a very pro-Israel party called the Patriotic Alliance. And in the Western Cape, which is where people expected foreign policy to loom large, where President Cyril Ramaphosa spent 4 hours campaigning in areas on foreign policy, vis-a-vis the International Court of Justice hearing, the ANC also lost a lot of ground. There they lose ground to this party, which is very pro-Israel, colored nationalists. Colored is a term we use in South Africa. And they also affect the ANC. The other thing which affected the ANC was that there was very high turnout amongst white minorities and colored minorities and Indian minorities. So this is how we arrive ourselves in the situation that the ANC falls from 58% to 40%. So I'm going to fast forward very quickly to Friday last week. And when Parliament gathered at 9 o'clock in the morning and ended at midnight, long into Shabbat, where they elected the Speaker, the Deputy Speaker, and the President. What was what was historic here was the least attractive, the least sexy, let me say, of the positions, the Deputy Speaker position. Because for the first time, and I need to know my facts here, but for the first time in many, many years, the DA, the official opposition, got the deputy speaker position. And what was clear then was that there was going to be a government of national unity with the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition for many, many years. And what is stunning about this development, Rabbi Genende, and what was stunning when the election results came in, that even though Australia might be thousands of kilometers from South Africa, and not everyone on the call knows about South Africa, the color red put worry into many people's eyes, because there was a party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by a charismatic young man called Julius Malema, the former ANC Youth League leader. I just told you, and I'm going to conclude very soon, that the ANC lost a lot of ground in this election. When South African voters went to the polls on the 29th of May, on Wednesday, the 29th of May, they were concerned that if the ANC fell to the 42% mark, Julius Malema and the Economic Freedom Fighters would be the kingmakers, and Julius Malema would become the deputy president. We arrived at a stunning result that the ANC plus EFF did not equal 201 out of 400 seats. We have 400 seats, 201 is the basic majority. So on the one hand, what was a stunning, and I'm going to end with this, the leader of the opposition, who I'm someone on publicly have criticized many, many times as saying, like, doesn't seem like up to the task. Two just images from Friday's vote in Parliament. The DA, for some reason, before the ANC, had a press conference to announce the formation of the government of national unity. And this, I always talk about the selfie test in politics. I go to embassy events and I look at who do the public go up to with selfies. And John Steenhuisen, the leader of the opposition, is someone who you do not go up to for a selfie. But on Friday, this changed. When all of the world's cameras, it was quite like, there's that scene of Aladdin where there are 100 swords at the throat of whoever that person is in Aladdin. I hope I'm using the right metaphor here, or description. It was quite unbelievable to see all these cameras set on John Steenhuisen. And a few hours later, to see Julius Malema with his shoulders down, with his with this forlorn expression on his face, as he just realized that we are in a wild new scenario, a scenario where I believe investment can flow, a scenario where I believe jobs can be created, a scenario where I believe that there will be more confidence in South Africa. But I'm sure we'll get to the million-dollar question later, is, are we going to see an immediate warming of ties between Israel and South Africa? I hope that was okay. Thank you.
We will certainly get there. And thanks, Wayne. That was a great synopsis. And I think it would have given a lot of people here a better understanding of just the kind of seismic shift that there's been now in the South African political scene, and the incredible implications of that, which hopefully we'll be able to tease out a little bit. I'd like to turn now to Ivor Chipkin. And Ivor has PhD, and he was an Oppenheimer Fellow at Oxford. Ivor is co-founder and director of the New South Institute, NSI, which works to strengthen delicate democracies, as well as he is also an academic and a director founder of the Public Affairs Research Institute at Wits, Witwatersrand University and UCT, University of Cape Town. And a lot has been said about your book, Ivor, which you wrote with Mark Swilling on state capture, which had a huge impact on the South African scene. And your latest book sounds quite intriguing, and I hope it's available on Amazon for us, or available. It's called The Shattered Vessel, which was published in 2023. So I have a question that I have for you is, after these elections now, are you more hopeful than, like Wayne is, for South Africa? You know, as South Africa has walked back from the precipice, and I remember the book that was captured the imagination a few years ago, Andre Reiter's book he speaks a lot about the failed state, and it was quite a devastating look at of corruption and where South Africa was going. And that, that now also that people like Wayne has referred to, like what he was once called the inconvenient youth, Malema and Jacob Zuma, who I guess would be called maybe also inconvenient, or maybe there were other epithets that were used for him in terms of a power broker. But is South Africa, I guess, for you now, no longer a shattered vessel? Is it a new vessel of hope?
Rabbi, thank you, and it's a great honor, of course, to be part of this panel. It's lovely to see Wayne and Karen. So it's an honor to be part of to join them. The Shattered Vessel is a book which is still coming. So I think the announcement of its publication was a little premature. It's a bit like some deaths announced prematurely. This is a book that perhaps has died prematurely, but hopefully it'll still be born. Yeah, I'm being working on it, and it'll come out hopefully fairly soon. I think the big takeaway for me around, I mean, the particular coalitions, the government of national unity that has just been formed, the circumstances are all quite remarkable. The decline of the African National Congress is astonishing. Wayne and I were on another seminar together, and I was predicting that I'd also be noticing sort of the gradual decline, the consistent decline of the ANC, about 4 to 6% per election. And I was assuming, because the ANC has a tradition of re-emerging at elections, a very powerful electoral machine, that it was likely to decline in that range. So I thought that it was quite likely that the ANC would come in at about 50%, maybe just below 50%. Boy, oh boy, was I stunned. Wayne's work at ENCA and Wayne had done some extraordinary work around showing the huge growth of the MK party. It certainly wasn't part of my calculation. So I think we were all stunned by the scale of the growth of the MK party. Now, what is important about the MK party, and for those of you that MK party was formed by former President Jacob Zuma, about whom I've written a lot in the head of this kind of the project of state capture in South Africa, is what he represented unambiguously was a part of a general cultural political trend in South Africa, was a refusal or a disillusionment with South Africa's constitutional settlement, and therefore a growing malaise in South African political elite circles around the constitutional settlement and the form of the constitution itself. And what he represents in that regard is momentum in that regard. So there was a for many people, including myself, there was a growing sense that there was discontent with the constitution, and therefore an openness to contesting the results of this election. There wasn't any clear and urgent threat to the electoral result, but nonetheless a general sense that the ANC was likely to win it comfortably, and therefore that question wouldn't pose itself. What is really important, I think, and I think this really is to the credits of Cyril Ramaphosa, about whom many of us are very, very critical, but nonetheless, in this particular instance, what is so important is that unambiguously, from the moment of the announcement of the ANC's very, very substantial setback, there was no question of the ANC, and especially of the Ramaphosa administration, of questioning that result. So what we have is, whatever the particular constellation of parties in a government of national unity or in a coalition is, what we have, which I think is a historical moment, a really historical moment, is a profound and unambiguous endorsement of South Africa's constitutional settlement, that the terms of political contestation must take place within the rules of South Africa's constitution and within the framework of South Africa's democracy. I think that is a remarkable, remarkable moment. And just to step back, for those of you that know anything about post-colonial history, will understand just how hugely significant this moment is. It's as important, for example, as the resurrection of or the re-establishment of democracy after the coup d'état after the attempted coup d'état in India, after the time of Indira Gandhi, the constitutional revolution there. This is a momentous historical moment, and the fact that we've come out on the side constitutionally of democracy, I think, is a huge breakthrough. So Wayne might be looking forward to prospects of growth and things like that. I'm a little not sure in terms of the configuration of the parties, but I do think we have to celebrate the fact that South Africa has turned a huge democratic and constitutional corner.
Thank you, Ivan, and that's I guess a celebration of democracy and of the democratic process in South Africa. And we will come back to that. I'd like to shift the focus now to our actual topic for tonight, which is called South Africa and Israel, Enemies or Friends. And that I'm going to call on you, Karen, Professor Karen Milner. Karen is the National Chairperson of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. And I don't know if you still are World Jewish Congress Vice President, WJC. Karen is also Associate Professor. She has some work outside of her community commitments, which are considerable and have been, as we were discussing a few minutes ago, have been so much greater since October 7. Karen is Associate Professor of Psych at Witwatersrand University. And like Ivor, she's also published extensively, and she is known for her advocacy for mental health. So my question to you, Karen, is that there was a lot of alarm, as we know, before the elections, and of course, but I've certainly referred to that in Wayne as well, about the stand of South Africa in terms of the International Court of Justice taking, and the genocide case it has taken, and I guess also about the betrayal which many, I think, within the community, and I think you've spoken about it maybe even, is the betrayal of Cyril Ramaphosa, of the kind of relationship that maybe the community thought they had with him. So I guess, Karen, my question to you then is, do you see a change now in the relationship with Israel? Is it going to be one that will approach more of is it a possibility of friendship as opposed to, as the evening is phrased, as opposed to being opponents or enemies?
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi. And it's lovely to be on this panel with really very esteemed co-panelists, Ivor and Wayne. Always lovely to be with you. It's a difficult question to answer. I think that there is no question that the South African Jewish community felt deeply betrayed by President Ramaphosa. And, if the communal Jewish heart broke on October the 7th, the South African Jewish heart broke on the 29th of December, which is when South Africa launched its case at the ICJ, at the International Court of Justice of Genocide against Israel. It was a betrayal of the Jewish community, and it was also, in my view, a betrayal of South Africa's stated foreign policy. So it's important to remember that the ANC's stated foreign policy on every foreign conflict globally has always been what they've either called neutrality or non-aligned. They take the position that the best way of dealing with conflict is through engagement with both sides. They use the historical position of the ANC and the miraculous transition from apartheid to post-apartheid, which is that you have to speak to your enemies in order to make peace. So there was something really off and disturbing and very upsetting for the Jewish community when the ANC and President Ramaphosa went against this policy in terms of taking not just a neutral or pro-Palestinian stance, but a very, very strong and active anti-Israel stance. I think it's important to note, though, and as odd as it might seem, there are two things that I think are important to note. The first is that, oddly enough, South Africa actually still has diplomatic relations with Israel. They have closed the embassy and the consulate in Israel, which is a real problem for South African Jewry, and I really do hope that that's something that will be addressed in the new dispensation, because at the moment there are thousands and thousands of South Africans without any consular services in a war zone, and that's obviously deeply problematic, and hopefully we can address that. At the moment, the Israeli ambassador to South Africa has been recalled. But he was recalled by Israel. So although there was a vote in the South African Parliament to have him removed from South Africa, that was not a binding vote. It has never been endorsed by the cabinet, which it needed to be endorsed by, but the Israelis took the decision to recall him to Israel. So we're in a strange situation in South Africa in terms of Israel-South Africa relations, in that officially there is no breaking off of diplomatic ties, but there is no South African embassy or consulate open in Israel, and there is no Israeli ambassador in South Africa. There is, however, a fully functioning embassy and consulate, and the deputy ambassadors here. I'm hoping that that will improve and that there will be some constraints on the viciousness of the ANC, the ex-ANC's government. So I've got to get used to a new term. It's no longer an ANC government, on the ex-ANC's government viciousness towards Israel. And I think what's quite important there is to see this, and maybe Wayne and Ivor could also chip in here, this has to be seen in the context also of an ANC which has global political positioning, which has been to turn itself towards its friendships are with Iran, with Russia, with China. Basically, it's turned away from its major trading partners, which are the US, European Union, Germany, who remain the major trading partners of South Africa, and to some extent China, towards this tremendous global friendship that it's having, and which is partly, I suspect, accounts for the position that South Africa has taken in relation to Israel. So I think that if South Africa and if the DA, which is it's now, of course, the major partner in the coalition or in the government of national unity, if we are looking for trade, for jobs, for rehabilitating ourselves on the global stage as a stable democracy, I think that there will have to be some toning down of the not just anti-Israel rhetoric, but the anti-Western rhetoric that we've been seeing from the ANC for a while leading up to the election. And the last thing I'm going to say on this is taking up Wayne's point. The very last election campaign that the ANC ran, the very last opportunity that the president now of the ANC, as opposed to the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, the last things he said to the South African potential voters, very last thing he said, was from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I think that what's really quite helpful for South African jury is to see how unsuccessful that was as an election strategy. Wayne pointed to it, but it's really something that gives us a certain amount of hope, is that the ANC's election platform was very much based on their foreign policy position, and the fact that they did not gain any votes, and that the very pro-Israel party in the Western Cape did gain votes, that they lost as already so tremendously, so enormously, does indicate that this has not been successful for them. And hopefully the DA will know that as well. This is not something that has been successful in obtaining votes for them. And that gives me some hope as well.
Thanks for that incredibly concise synopsis as well, Karen. And just something just flowing from what you said, and I'm maybe interested in with Wayne and Ivor want to chip in, is do we know what the attitude is of the coalition parties towards Israel? Do they have any stated position? Did they embrace the, from the river to the sea and the genocide case? Do we know?
Yeah, I can answer that briefly. So as of today, there are 4 other parties which have joined the government of national unity or signed intent. The president still has to announce the cabinet. So the Democratic Alliance and the Inkatha Freedom Party traditionally have very close ties to the Jewish community and moderate pragmatic views on Israel. They both support the two-state solution and would support a resumption of ties between South Africa and Israel. Then you have the Patriotic Alliance, is that party I referred to earlier, which are extremely pro-Israel at a community rally just after October the 7th. Their deputy leader made a speech, which I think many in the community still remember, as a party which stands very, very strongly with the people of Israel. Their take is South Africa has far more pressing issues in our own backyard, and we should be less concerned about conflicts in other parts of the world. And then there's a tiny party which got 0.22% of the vote. The only reason they got a seat is because of remainders, where they are very critical of Israel. But I mean, they won seat. So of all the parties which are coming into the government, 3 out of the 4, and they're far bigger than this tiny party, are more moderate, more pragmatic, have good ties to the Jewish community, which Karen has been integral at establishing and solidifying over the last few years. So that is the way I would analyze it.
And Rabbi, there's one small little detail, is that the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of South African Foreign Affairs, Naledi Pandor, who's really driven the kind of radicalization of foreign policy, she didn't even make it back to Parliament. She was a victim of the ANC's massive electoral decline. So she's no longer even an MP. So she could still become a minister. It would require a presidential special exception. He's allowed to. Whether he would find sufficient consensus is the term being used amongst the new coalition partners, whether there would be sufficient consensus amongst the coalition to establish her as minister, that we're going to see whether that happens, or whether there's even a desire to have her back in cabinet. But that is the scale of the ANC's defeat, but it's also a real potential sea change in foreign policy.
Can I shift it a bit? Because I think a lot of us are wondering, what's the feeling in the South African Jewish community? I don't know if you can speak. What are you picking up? Because, what I'm hearing is that, ironically, South African Jews feel safer than Jews in Australia and then in other places in the world. So kind of phrasing it in your thing, Karen, is like, what's the mental health of the South African Jewish community? How are they feeling about the elections now?
Thanks, Rabbi. That's a really interesting question. And I think firstly, most people are relieved. In terms of directly response, in terms of the election, most people are relieved. I don't think we could have asked, really, under the circumstances. It's unlikely we could have asked for a better outcome. Obviously, we would have liked the ANC to have got 0. But practically, this was, we've spoken about how astounding these results are. I think there's tremendous relief that the ANC-EFF couldn't form a coalition. And I think as South Africans first, this does seem to be a coalition that can perhaps drive some positive outcomes for South Africa as a whole. As a community, though, in terms specifically in relation to Israel and the feeling that we've been enormously under assault from our government, that's one side of the South African Jewish experience that we've had over the last couple of months. But what's quite important is, and I always say, South African Jewry live in a state of paradox, and you have to be comfortable with paradox to be a South African Jew. Because on the one hand, you've got this incredible hostility, or you had this incredible hostility from the ANC, still the biggest party in what was in the ANC government. But we were not experiencing nearly the levels of hostility on the street that we've seen around the world. So, for example, encampments at South African universities, the 2 major universities, or 3 major universities that South African Jews go to, my university, Wits University, University of Cape Town, there was a call for encampments by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Naledi Pandor, because there was so little enthusiasm on the part of students to take it up. The one at Cape Town had around 6 tents and was disbanded. Apparently everybody got COVID. The one at Wits also had it lasted a week. There was but again, very small number of tents. Students barely noticed it. I was recently in the US. I was in Washington, and I went, just as one does in Washington, I went for a walk to the White House because my hotel was nearby to see it, and I got caught up in a protest against Biden. And that was one of the most terrifying for me, the demographics of that protest, the levels of hostility, the incredible hostility that I saw there was more frightening than I've experienced, in fact, I think ever in South Africa. So we're not seeing this level of hostility from the street in South Africa. We are seeing it from the government. And I'll quote one of our board members who said, for him, nothing's really changed. He still goes to Shul on a Friday night, happily walks along the streets of Glen Hazel. Nobody hides their kippot. You can't see it now, but I wear my Magen David very comfortably. I will be, in fact, at the inauguration of the president with the Magen David. There's no sense of immediate threat on the streets of South Africa. And I think that's something that people really struggle to understand. And the only way I could describe it is living with paradox.
I wonder, Wayne or Ivor, did you have anything to comment regarding that?
And I can confirm that. I mean, I think what has been so interesting during this period, even though there's been sort of radicalization of the rhetoric and certainly the radicalization of South Africa's position on the international front, but within South Africa, there have been no incidents of attack on Jewish installations, on people. I mean, I live in a different part of Johannesburg to Karen, and I walk to Shul with a kippah. There's not an issue. The rabbi lives in an area where there's a very large Muslim population. There's not even remotely an issue. So there's no anxiety about being in public and being a Jew in South Africa. There was even, Karen, perhaps you could say a little bit more. You staged a demonstration outside a big gathering of sort of a Palestinian solidarity conference which was held in Johannesburg recently, and there was even, I understand, a demonstration of which there was no physical attack, or there may have been some bad tempers, but I think there was no threat to the people demonstrating. I know that some people even attended the conference. So that's one of the great paradoxes of South Africa. We have, strangely enough, a political culture that tends towards radicalism, of great ferociousness of the political culture, but at the same time, there is profound, strange tolerance in South Africa as well. And associated with that, I don't think that there's a deep anti-Semitism amongst the broad public. I think what we've seen recently is the radicalization of the political elites. I think it's been driven by the success of BDS, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that going forward. But I don't think it's an expression of a deep hostility towards Jews in South Africa. Adam Mendelsohn from the Kaplan Center at the University of Cape Town, they undertook recently a survey of South Africans and looking specifically at anti-Semitism. And what they found was expressions of anti-Semitism in South Africa are very, very low. Most South Africans are largely indifferent to Jews, or they just simply categorize Jews as part of the white population more generally. So there's no specific antagonism or hostility to Jews as per se.
And Wayne, also, you kind of mentioned that it was really surprising for us, I guess, is because we have such a aggressive Muslim and Palestinian protests on our streets virtually every day, virtually every week, and there really is a torrent still of anti-Semitic. The line between anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic is often it's just dissolved completely in many of them. I mean, just one rather crude example yesterday at the library which is in the center of Melbourne City, and they have Palestinian protests every single week. They were handing out toilet paper which was with the Israeli flag on it. They spent a lot of money on getting that, but just gives you just some kind of indication of the crassness and of the vitriol that we are experiencing. But it seems, if I'm reading correctly, that even from the Muslim voters, people, that there isn't that same kind of venom and vitriol. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I can give you some examples. So let's take the Muslim equivalent of Ripponlea and Caulfield, the Muslim in the city of Cape Town. So just imagine those two areas, and I know Ripponlea is in Caulfield, but upper middle class, middle to upper middle class Muslim area where some of the great ANC struggle icons come from, like Dullah Omar, was a giant in the struggle. And then the suburb of Gatesville, which is a very conservative, religious Muslim community, so like Ripponlea. There, the DA lost votes in this election, but so too did the ANC. So despite the ANC sending the Lady Pandor to these communities, sending the president to these communities, doubling down, tripling down on the messaging, and at times the messaging was vicious. So from a political perspective, not on a street perspective, it just did not translate into votes. The ANC also lost ground in these communities. And this is a fascinating outcome. It just wasn't a vote winner in the election. And I think Muslim South Africans, like Jewish South Africans, like Zulu South Africans, like Xhosa South Africans, when they came to the ballot box, it was about jobs. It was about opportunities for their kids. It wasn't really about foreign policy in this election.
Thank you. So that is, I think, fascinating in terms of, you say, the paradoxes. I wanted to just ask Ivor, another question. I mean, Ivor, you know, another thing that has focused the minds of Jews across the world has been the betrayal, if you like, of the left. So many, you know, Jewish people who identified with leftist kind of causes and were at the forefront of them, you know, including in South Africa, feel, you know, that the left has now betrayed, and you know, they're supporting every other kind of cause, but not that, you know, but Jews are excluded from it. I wonder, you know, if you and the others want to comment on that, but starting with yourself, Ivor.
Yeah, Rabbi, it's a hugely important question, and it's not just in South Africa. And I think Karen also alluded to something very important, which I want to touch on. I think, myself included, who I've historically regarded myself as someone on the left, were shocked by the reaction of people that one worked with, colleagues of one, and broad sort of left-wing organizations. I mean, I wish I could show you some of the things that have been said on WhatsApp, for example, amongst social groups which are, you know, historically have played important roles in the democratic struggle in South Africa. UDF, United Democratic Front, WhatsApp groups, for example, groups which I've even founded in the sort of in the heat of the struggle against state capture in South Africa. You know, progressive public servants, people of great principle, often deeply sympathetic and supportive of the anti-apartheid struggle, but also the democratic struggle after 1994. Suddenly these groups became alive with things which are, you know, quite quickly and quite radically overstep the boundary between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. You know, those are people saying things like there's no such thing as an Israeli civilian. This was an act of legitimate resistance. Absolute denial of the atrocities of Hamas on October the 7th. Denial of rape, denial of the killing of children. You know, it's just blanket denials of this kind of stuff, which is just straightforwardly unacceptable. So you have especially in the public domain, amongst the sort of elements of sort of a left elite, this extraordinary radicalization, and then the appearance of a whole lot of sentiments which were just, quite frankly, outrageous. I think, and this is what I think is really, really important, both in South Africa and around the world, I think one massively underestimated movements like BDS, a Boycott, Divest and Sanctions movement, that have been, perhaps not very effectively, but nonetheless, they've been consistently mobilizing and working on developing a narrative, at least from before the Durban conference, anti-racism, World UN Anti-Racism Conference in 2000. You saw in the preparation for that conference, a whole range of tropes being developed. Some of them old, some of them come from the PLO, but nonetheless being packaged in a very particular way in preparation for the Durban conference. And in particular, three concepts being brought together very forcefully. One is that Israel is a settler colony. Secondly, that Israel is an apartheid state. And thirdly, interestingly enough, that Israel is a genocidal state. So you'll see that those are the statements being made in the Durban conference of 2001. Of course, the fourth one is that Zionism is racism. So four tropes. What BDS, I think, has been doing over the last 25 years, almost 25 years, it's been insinuating those discourses into the universities, into civil society, and into the broad public domain. So these are the sort of ideas in left-wing circles, but even in broadly progressive circles, liberal circles. And most importantly, these ideas, they've been giving these ideas intellectual respectability by especially building them on the university campuses. So it seems as if these discourses are not just polemical. The BDS positions are not just polemical, but rather the claim that Israel is an apartheid state or a settler colony, etc. These seem to have, or given a deep intellectual respectability, because they seem to be substantiated by a large intellectual project as well. Mm-hmm. So this is where I think BDS has been very, very successful, and I do think that left Jewish groups, Zionist groups, and others have been completely outmaneuvered in this front. And this is why I think going forward, what is absolutely critical is serious attention being paid to the battle of ideas. Mm-hmm. Because the left, the democratic left, or let me call it that, the non-Hamas left, and other sympathetic to Israel and Jewish groups have completely evacuated the terrain of the battle of ideas. And this is where I think an enormous amount of work needs to go into, a lot of attention needs to be paid going forward.
Mm-hmm. I think it was attributed to Freud. Karen could get me right if I'm not, but he said we are only as strong as our ideas are, and we've been caught napping. I mean, we are a people of the word, a people of ideas, but somehow we were caught asleep, and we have a lot of work to do. And I imagine that's I know that there are moves here across Australia among leading figures in our community to address that. You may have seen there was our former finance minister here in Australia, Josh Frydenberg, put out a movie, and we interviewed leading Australians in the fight against anti-Semitism. We have a lot of work to do. I know there are a few questions from the floor, but perhaps I just did want to, in case Wayne and Karen wanted to comment on anything that Ivor's just brought up before I get to the questions. Was there anything in particular, or should we go straight to the questions? Wayne,
one comment I want to make, just following up from Ivor. Firstly, I agree with everything he said, and we are way behind and need to catch up urgently. And I mean, I think we have been banging on about this for a while in South Africa. In particular, South African universities. I don't think it started at a South African university, but IAW, Israel Apartheid Week, was a feature on South African universities and something that we've been fighting for many, many years. And, it was seen as an isolated issue, this Israel Apartheid Week. Not much attention was given to it. It was just shame poor South Africans have to deal with that. And I think that the fact that this has now spread so viciously across campuses around the world does show that a lot of the tropes, as Ivor said, that often found fertile ground in South Africa, those are the tropes that then spread around the world. And we really do need to pay. We've managed quite well. Our Israel Apartheid Weeks, we've really managed quite well in the last few years. To make sure that they're not threatening to Jewish students, to work with other student leaders, to make them opportunities for us to engage on Israel in more positive ways. But I think it really talks to what I was speaking about. On the one hand, there's the academic, the faculty positioning, which feeds these narratives in ways that I think we have shamefully neglected.
It would be, I think, we have that on our campuses as well. Maybe we could learn from the way that you've been confronting it, because I know our students, the Australian Union of Jewish Students, feel under incredible pressure at the moment. I'm going to move to the questions because we don't have very long. And the first question here was, and I think in a sense it has been answered, so maybe I'll go to the second one, which was, how beholden is the ANC to Iran financially? Would Iran have had any influence on who the ANC joined within the government, the new government? That is, that they did not want the ANC to have very nationalist partners who could possibly work against Iran and companies. So I guess it's really a question is I don't know who would like to answer that one.
So just briefly, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa was expanded to include a range of other countries. The country which really stood out in its inclusion was Iran, because if you had to take Asian economies by GDP, countries like Indonesia, who I know Australians will obviously know well, Malaysia, even Bangladesh, have a far greater GDP than Iran. So it didn't make sense to me why Iran was added to BRICS. But South Africa pushed very, very hard for BRICS. In the last year, our foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, met the recently deceased foreign minister of Iran on six occasions. That's a hell of a lot in a short space of time. She also met with the now deceased president of Iran in the last year. So there was a clear effort, and it was on South Africa's part, to draw Iran closer to South Africa. And again, from a rational perspective, from a pragmatic perspective, it doesn't make any sense. And However, now, I mean, the second part of the question is no. I mean, Iran wouldn't have wanted the DA, the Democratic Alliance, or the Inkatha Freedom Party, the Patriotic Alliance, to be in this government of national unity. They are going to be. So maybe, I think certainly in certain portfolios, like the portfolio of international relations, which is in Australia, I think foreign ministry, it seems to be stronger there, but I don't think as strong in other parts of the government, because we now have a government of national unity, which includes coalition partners who do not wave the flag of Iran too often, at all, no, not alone too often. Yes.
Thanks for that. And the next question was also sort of connected to what we were speaking, and has been answered to a certain extent, but it says connected to questioning, is there anti-Semitism in South Africa, and from whom? I heard that most of it comes from leftists, the unions, and Muslims. That's the question.
So I'm happy to take that one. Oh, okay. There is anti-Semitism in South Africa. I think I don't want to make it, it's just not been as severe as I think we've seen in other countries. And like all other countries, there was a huge spike in anti-Semitism after October the 7th. We saw a 600% increase. And we did see at least one attack on a rabbi, in fact, in South Africa. So there is anti-Semitism in South Africa, and certainly some of the government rhetoric falls into anti-Semitic discourse as well. It does come a lot. I don't think it's helpful to divide. I don't think it's very helpful to say, where does it come from? It comes from both sides. We do have an element, it's been more muted lately. There's definitely some right-wing anti-Semitism in South Africa. There is still a small neo-Nazi grouping, kind of white supremacist grouping in South Africa. After October the 7th, we haven't seen them come out as strongly, but we definitely have got some right-wing anti-Semitism in South Africa. And certainly sometimes it's directed, interestingly, we see left and right-wing anti-Semitism directed at Jewish business leaders. And that's been a real problem. We've seen a boycott, and that's come largely from the Muslim community, and to some extent from the trade unions. We've seen a boycott of Jewish businesses in South Africa, which is very distressing. We've seen attacks on Jewish businesses, including some of the major retailers and manufacturers in South Africa. And what's interesting is that they often get it from both sides. They get the right-wing anti-Semitism in terms of, South African Jews own the economy type anti-Semitism, particularly when they adhere to our BEE legislation, which requires them to have a certain proportion of Black people in managerial positions. And then since October the 7th, there have been boycotts on them. If they've had a photo in Israel, they've been targeted by the more left-wing trade union anti-Semitism.
So perhaps, since we need to be wrapping up, I wonder if there's just a final comment, a very brief one from each of you, about how are you feeling about the future for South Africa, and specifically for South African Jewry? And Ivor, do you want to kick that one off for us?
Yes, I mean, I'm wanting just to enjoy the current moment, and the current moment is one of relief. There's some optimism. This looks like some kind of democratic center has formed. It's there, and it seems to be emerging. And I want to just enjoy that space for the moment. I think there are all sorts of good reasons to be very worried about its ability to hold together. I'm very worried about the number of people that didn't turn up in the election at all and what they're doing. They didn't just go to sleep. I think there's all sorts of very, very big clouds on the margins of things. So, but for the moment, I want to enjoy the current moment, and I think, and be optimistic about what it promises. South Africa could go in several directions, and consolidation of South Africa's constitutional democracy is certainly one of them, and a possibility of prosperity is unambiguously an option going forward. And I would like us to focus on that for the moment. I think the radicalization in foreign policy, I think, has taken a huge hit. The key people are no longer in positions. Some of the administration, some of the key sort of staff in the administration are in position, and they might survive a new government, and what that means we'll see going forward. So it's not a clear picture. But I do think, given what we've been through and the fact that, I mean, I think Karen corrected me in all sorts of ways. There have been efforts. There have been certain kinds of attacks, but they've been soft attacks. There've been no physical attacks on, or very, very few. I didn't know about the rabbi that was attacked. It hasn't been a major phenomenon in South Africa. So I think Jewish life in South Africa is safe. It's smaller than it used to be, but it's certainly robust in certain areas. There's reason to be optimistic again about South Africa's future. So that's where I would like to focus.
I'll have to ask Wayne and Karen to keep it really brief because we have to end off. But I wonder, do you end off also with the Hatikva note, Wayne?
Yeah, just very briefly, on Saturday night, I was at a dinner party and I made a big toast. I think I always tell my kids, you have to celebrate small milestones. It has been a significant few days with leadership, with leaders like Karen, with thought leaders like Ivor, with many other great people in this country and remarkable sunsets. I remain somewhat maybe naively optimistic. The numbers of the community size are a concern. But today we have a far better trajectory than we did 2 weeks ago.
Thank you. Karen, last word.
Sure. I have to say this, many people ask why do we stay in South Africa? Is there a future? I want to say the South African Jewish community is the most remarkable, beautiful community. And it is a community really worth fighting for. So we're in a better position, as we've all said, and like I also want to enjoy the moment. The ANC got what the South Africans on this webinar will understand what I'm about to say. The ANC got a snot clap. Given the way that they betrayed us, I'm delighted that they got the snot clap, and I'm enjoying it. It's a really hard smack for those who don't understand it. But we have an amazing community. We're also the only voice at the moment in the whole of Africa. This little community on the southernmost tip of Africa are the only voice against the vile rhetoric that our previous government was saying. I believe it's a community worth fighting for. I believe it is a really, really remarkable, beautiful community. We're a proud community. And as Ivor said, and I think the fact that people often say there's no anti-Semitism in South Africa is not a mistake. It's because it's there, but we don't feel it. We continue as a proud and amazing community. So thank you all very much.
Well, I think having had the pleasure and the privilege of actually sharing the session with you, I think that you three certainly represent something of the substance, the character, and the hope for the South African Jewish community, and indeed for South Africa itself. So I really thank you for your contribution, but I'm going to hand over just for our final words to Sharon Berger, who is here from Sharon's role is the Events and Partnership Manager at the Jewish Independent. And Sharon, final words to yourself.
Thank you, Rabbi Genende, and thank you to all of our panelists. These are definitely feels like unprecedented times in so many ways, and certainly in South Africa, but also around the world. And it's been really great to have your insights and your analysis, and to be able to take the smaller trends and help us see the bigger pictures of what's going on and what it means. And it's certainly a space that we will be watching closely. As most of you probably know, the Jewish Independent is the place to go for lots of thoughtful analysis. We've had both Rabbi Genende and Ivor write for us in the past, and I'm sure they'll be writing for us in the future. So if you'd like to know more about this, as well as all of our Israel coverage and Australian Jewish coverage, please subscribe, follow us, and join us for future events. And thank you very much for coming this evening, and see you soon.
Thank you. Shalom. Tot ziens.
Thank you.